So the story that I've got for you now involves mud, kind of. So it's a good follow-on from Rachel's. But we're moving away from Sussex mud. We are moving to Northern Irish mud, and we are moving specifically to a place called Carland. Because back in the way back when, Carland was all covered in bogs. There were great pools of dark water, there were trickling streams of green water, and there was an amazing kind of mud that I'm going to double check the name of. Mools, which when you stepped on them, they squelched. So I think this has been a good evening for names of mud. And the people who lived in the Carland Moors, in the Carland Fens, were protected. They were watched over by the moon. When the moon shone bright down on the moors, you could walk as safely as if it were the daytime. But, of course, the moon waxes and wanes, and on those nights when the moon was dark, terrible things would come out of those bogs, crawling horrors and witch bodies and bogles, and they would enact all sorts of mischief and wickedness. Now the moon had heard about these terrible things that happened, but of course she was dark on those days and so had never seen them for herself, and she wanted to see if it was really as bad as everybody had said. So, at the end of the month, at the point where the moon turns dark, she stepped down out of the sky and she wrapped herself in a great black cloak so that she wouldn't be seen, and so her shining dress was covered in the cloak, her shining silver hair covered in the hood, and the only light that glimmered was the tiniest little bit from her feet poking out at the bottom. And she stood at the edge of the fens, looking at the pools of water glittering only with the starlight, and she listened to the creeping, crunching, squelching sounds of the things that lived within, and she trembled a little in her soul. But she was determined that she would not return back to the sky until she had explored these bogs for herself and made a true account of what lived there. So she made her way, leaping as light as air from tuft to tuft, going past the tangling snares that bent down over the pools of water. And she listened to the bogles bubbling, and she listened to the witch bodies shrieking, and she listened to the crawling horrors pulling their way through the mud, and she watched the will-o'-the-wisps sparkling their way across to try and mislead travellers as they went. And as she went, she stepped too close to the edge of one of those great dark pools, and her foot slipped in, and to try and get her balance, she grabbed onto one of the snares hanging nearby, and it twisted around her wrists as tight as handcuffs and held her firmly. And now her foot was stuck deep in that sinking mud, and her hands were caught tight on the snare, and no matter how she struggled, she could not free herself. And as she was there, struggling away in that dark pool, she heard a sound, and this was a human sound. She heard the sound of a young boy, younger than our proud youth from the story before. This boy was, maybe 13. A boy who is desperate to be seen as a man, but still in many ways very much a child. And this young man, this boy, had been making his way back across the bogs, trying to get back home to safety on the darkest night, which is an unwise thing to do. And he was weeping a little to himself and crying out as he slipped at the edge of the pools, and as cold, wet fingers grasped at his ankles and claws scraped at the back of his legs. And as the moon watched, she saw that he was being guided by one of those will-o'-the-wisps right to the great pool where she was, where he would slip in and certainly drown. Now the moon, at least in this story, doesn't speak in the language that humans speak. There was nothing that she could say. She couldn't call out to this boy and let him know that he was being led astray. So all that she could do was struggle harder, as hard as she can, throwing her head back until finally that dark hood fell backwards and the shining light of her silver hair lit up the scene, and all of a sudden the boy could see the path, he could see the fens, he could see his way home, and in his terror at this blinding light before him, he turned and he slipped and he squelched through the mools, but he made his way back out to safety. And he never once looked back. He never once looked to see the source of that light. He never saw, not truly, the moon struggling in that dark pool there. But all of the crawling horrors and the witch bodies and the bogles did. And they gathered around and rubbed their clawed hands with glee to talk about all the things that they could do now to their old enemy, who would push them away into the darkness and the shadows every time she shone bright in the sky. And the witch body said, "Let's poison her." And the crawling horror said, "Let's smother her." And the moon, caught between them all, sat defeated and wished that she were dead and done with. But the good thing about these horrible creatures of the bog is they were so despicable that they couldn't decide among them what they were going to do. They argued all through the night until finally the grey of dawn began to rise, and they realised that they would be chased away by the light of the sun. So in the end they decided they would simply push the moon deep down under the water in that dark pool, and they got a great heavy stone and pulled it over the top of her so she wouldn't be able to free herself. And they set one of the little will-o'-the-wisps to sit on top in the branches of that great snare and keep watch to make sure that she didn't move from her hiding place. And so the moon was trapped under the water. And as the days passed and the time of the dark moon was finished, those who observed the turning of the moon put bright pennies in their pockets, put straw in their caps to welcome the new waxing moon. And she didn't come. She didn't come for a whole month. For a whole month the sky was dark, and those creeping horrors and witch bodies and bogles, they grew bold. They grew fearsome. They tapped and rattled at people's windows. They dragged sheep out into the sucking mud. They committed all sorts of terrible atrocities that they would never have done with the moon shining bright above them. People went to the wise women of the village and asked what they could do, and the wise women looked in their cauldrons and they looked in their mirrors and they looked in their books, but all was dark. Without the moon in the sky, their wisdom didn't lead anywhere. And they said, we've got nothing. We will have to ask. Somebody, somewhere, must have seen something. And so news spread from group to group, from village to village, all the way across the fens, until finally it came to a little village right at the very, very edge of the fens. And there in a pub the news came that the moon had been missing from the sky all this time. And a young man, still a little bit of a boy, who was sat by the fire, listened to what the storytellers had to say, listened to what the elders of the village were saying, and all of a sudden, that evening of terror and darkness and blinding light that he had all but forgotten in the safety of getting back home, suddenly had meaning. He knew what it was that he had seen, and he went and tugged on the storyteller's sleeves and said, "I know where the moon is. She's out somewhere in one of those dark pools." And so they went and spoke to the wise women, and the wise women said, "Well, if she is hiding in one of those dark pools, then we have mischief of the bogles afoot here. You need to go out just before nightfall. You need to take a group of strong young people with you, and they must carry with them, they must put a stone in their mouths so they do not speak, for if they speak, then the bogles and the creeping horrors will fall upon them. And they must carry with them hazel wands. Hazel, which is the symbol of the moon. Hazel, which is the symbol of finding what you are looking for. Hazel, which is used for dousing in pools of water. And these hazel wands will help you find where the moon is. You need to look for a coffin, a cross, and a candle, and when you find those three things, the moon will not be far behind." And so it was done. A group of brave young people got together, each with a stone in their mouths for silence, each with a hazel wand to lead them through the moors and the fens, and as the sun began to dip below the horizon, off they went into that sucking, sticking mud. And wet fingers creeped out of the water and grabbed at their ankles, and claws raked at the back of their cloaks, and they trembled and crossed themselves, but never a word they said. And as they made their way following those hazel wands, they came across a strange sight. A great stone lodged into one of those dark pools that looked almost coffin-shaped. Above it, a snare with its arms spread wide, looking almost like a cross, and in the branches of that snare a little flickering will-o'-the-wisp, just like a candle flame. And so the young people gathered around that great stone, and they heaved it up out of the water, and for a moment as they looked down, they saw a luminous, beautiful, shining, smiling face. And then the light became too dazzling. They shielded their faces with their hands, and in the next moment, as they looked up, there was the full moon back in the sky, and all of the creeping beasts that had snuck up upon them retreated, hissing and bubbling back into those pools and back into the darkness. And so the moon was returned to the sky. And from that day on, she continued to shine brightly and keep the crawling horrors and the witch bodies and the bogles at bay. And so she does in Sussex, so she does in the Americas, so she does around the world. But it is said that in Carland, she shines just that bit brighter.